In this video lesson, we're going to be talking about some of the most important characters in the Civil War. So to start off, we're going to talk about Abraham Lincoln. Now, he was the President of the United States from 1860 to 1865. And with being the President, that means that you are the Commander-in-Chief of the Army. So he was the head of the Union during the Civil War. He is the one who issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and that's the statement that declared that all slaves just in the Confederate States would be free. Now, that's often a misconception. There were states that stuck with the Union during the Civil War that still practiced slavery. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not outlaw slavery in those states yet. That would have to wait until the 13th Amendment. Now, he also gave the Gettysburg Address that exact same year, and the Gettysburg Address honored the soldiers who fought and died at the Battle of Gettysburg. He was the man who appointed the generals to command the Union Army. Specifically, he was in charge of promoting Ulysses S. Grant to being the head of the Union Army, and overall he just steered the country through one of its most difficult times of transition. Our next character that we're discussing is Jefferson Davis. So he is the opposite of Lincoln, as he was the president but for the Confederate States of America. So he was also the commander-in-chief of the Confederate Army, similar to how Lincoln was the commander-in-chief of the Union Army. Now, before he was elected president, he was a senator from the southern state of Mississippi. He was overall considered an unsuccessful president, as most of his efforts went towards the military and trying to win the Civil War versus some of his responsibilities to the government in the role of the presidency. So overall considered an unsuccessful president. Okay, next we have Robert E. Lee. He was a war hero from the Mexican War, where the U.S. fought against Mexico a little over a decade before the Civil War broke out. And again, the Mexican War, that was a war that gave us vast amounts of territory in the southwestern part of what's today the U.S. So he was widely regarded as a brilliant military mind. In fact, he was so well thought of that he was asked by Abe Lincoln to lead the Union Army. However, Lee declined that offer. He said no, even though he was opposed to the issue of slavery. So even though his viewpoints went pretty well with the Union or the North side, he felt that his loyalty to his home state of Virginia was above his loyalty to his country. So he decided to turn down Lincoln's offer, and he became the general-in-chief of the Confederate Army, so the head general of the South. Lee was the best general to fight in the Civil War. Now, his counterpart, especially in the later part of the Civil War, was a guy named Ulysses S. Grant. Now, he was a poor student at West Point, which is a school for officers in the Army. He eventually rose through the ranks of the Union Army. He became commander of the Union Army after his great victory at the Battle of Vicksburg. And though he was generally outmatched by Robert E. Lee, Grant eventually forced Lee to surrender because Grant had the advantage of having more soldiers and supplies at his disposal. So he became this great war hero, and he used that celebrity status to rise his way to eventually becoming a president of the United States for 2 terms. Alright, the next guy we're talking about is a Confederate general, and his name is Thomas Jackson. Now, he also has the nickname of Stonewall. He was one of Robert E. Lee's most trusted generals, and he got that nickname Stonewall during one of the battles of the Civil War, during the Battle of Bull Run. So even though the Union was charging and firing, most of the Confederate Army was starting to retreat. However, Jackson and his troops stood firm and they halted the Union advance. And then there was another Confederate leader named Bernard E.B. who shouted, "Look, men, there stands Jackson like a stone wall." And he used that as a rallying cry to try to have some of the other Confederates stand and remain fighting. So he got that nickname Stonewall, and just for the record, the Confederates did win the first Battle of Bull Run, otherwise known as the Battle of Manassas. Okay, so on the flip side, we've got another general who was for the Union. So his name was William Tecumseh Sherman, or William T. Sherman. He was a Union general, as I mentioned. He was put in charge by Ulysses S. Grant of capturing the cities in Georgia of Atlanta and Savannah. Now, what his army did is they marched all the way to the sea of the Atlantic Ocean, but all along the way they would burn and destroy every town, field, and railroad they came across. So not only was the Civil War a war fought between armies and fields, it was also one of the first wars where civilians and people outside of the actual warfare battles had a major um, brunt of the fighting, where they suffered because of some of the different tactics against the civilians. So here is a quote from William T. Sherman. He said, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over." So essentially what he's saying is that war is mean. It's really mean. And he's saying you cannot refine it. There's no way around that. War is always going to be mean. War is always going to be cruel. He says the crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. So the more devastating it is, the more hurtful it is, the sooner he believed his enemy would surrender, leading to an overall success. So the crueler it was, the meaner it was for a short amount of time, he believed that would be the greater good in the long run. Is that something you agree with? Alright, next we have a lady named Clara Barton. She also had a pretty cool nickname. She became known as the Angel of the Battlefield. What she did is she collected food and medical supplies for Union troops. She would travel to the different battlefields, and at the battlefield she would work as a nurse and give supplies to the armies. Later, she had the foresight and insight to start the American Red Cross, who to this day provides relief to victims of natural disasters. So she still has a lasting legacy in our country today. Next up, we have Harriet Tubman. She is the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, and you can see that conductor is in quotation marks here, because obviously the Underground Railroad was not something where they used trains and stations. The Underground Railroad was a secret organization that helped free slaves from the South. Now, usually they did use code words similar to what you would have on a train, such as conductors. Um, she risked her life escaping slavery herself. Then she spent 10 years leading hundreds of slaves from the South to freedom in the North. So a very famous lady. And finally, we have a man named Frederick Douglass. Now, he was one of the most important abolitionist leaders. And abolitionist, that's a fancy word for a person who was working to end slavery. So abolitionists spoke out against slavery. He himself escaped from slavery and taught himself to read and to write. And he was the one who persuaded President Lincoln to allow former slaves to fight in the Union Army. So former slaves to fight for the end of slavery in this war. Uh, Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.